Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive with me? This time, we're going way back to 1518, Strasbourg.
Ooh, Strasbourg. What's the story there?
Well, think famine, disease, political unrest, your typical medieval stressors.
Sounds rough already.
It gets weirder, people start dancing.
Dancing. Like a festival.
No, not the fun kind. It was uncontrollable, non-stop dancing in the streets. Dozens, then hundreds.
Hundreds of people just dancing. That's wild.
I know, right? We're talking 500 years later, and historians are still scratching their heads trying to figure out what caused this.
That's crazy. So what are some of the theories?
Well, there's mass hysteria, bad bread, even a saint's curse. We're going to deep dive into all of that today.
I'm hooked already. Let's hear it.
So picture this. July 1518, the heat is scorching. This woman, Frau Trofeus, steps out into the street and just snaps, starts dancing.
Just out of the blue.
Yeah, her movements were wild, this strange look on her face, like agony and ecstasy all mixed together.
So it wasn't just like regular dancing.
No, not at all. And then, as the days go by, more people join her, like they're being pulled by invisible strings.
Okay, so you're living in Strasbourg. You see your neighbors, your friends, even kids, caught in this terrifying dance marathon. What's going through your mind?
I'd be freaked out.
Yeah, fear, confusion, desperation. That'd be natural. But you know what the authorities did?
What, they tried to stop it?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But they actually thought encouraging the dancing was the solution.
What? Seriously?
Yeah, they built stages, hired musicians. They thought it would just tire people out.
Like, oh, you want to dance? Here's a bigger stage and some music.
Pretty much. Of
Yeah.
course, it totally backfired. The dancing intensified, people collapsing from exhaustion, heart attacks, the whole 9 yards.
Right. It's like they thought they were dealing with, like, a bad case of the Mondays, not a full-blown crisis.
Totally. Back then, they didn't have the framework to understand these things like we do now. One prevailing theory is mass hysteria.
Mass hysteria, like everyone just losing their minds.
Kinda. Think of Strasbourg like a pressure cooker, right? All these anxieties bubbling away, and then, bam, they find this weird release valve in this massive dance frenzy.
So one person's behavior sets everyone off.
Exactly. Social contagion. You see someone dancing like that, you hear talk of a dancing plague, and fear takes over. Before you know it, you're swept up in the same frenzy.
So it's like a medieval viral trend, but way more intense.
Definitely more intense.
Yeah.
There's another theory, involves bad bread and a fungus.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that. Something about ergot poisoning.
Exactly. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, a staple food back then. And get this, it contains compounds similar to LSD.
Wait a minute, you're saying they were all tripping on bad bread?
That's the idea. Ergot poisoning can cause all sorts of crazy symptoms. Convulsions, delusions, even gangrene.
Okay, I kind of see how that could explain the dancing.
But there are some problems with this theory. First off, ergot usually causes muscle spasms, not coordinated dancing.
Ah, I see.
Plus, ergot poisoning doesn't last for weeks, which is how long this dancing plague went on for.
So, intriguing theory, but maybe not the whole story. What about the supernatural stuff? Wasn't there a saint's curse involved?
This is where it gets even wilder. Back in 16th century Europe, people were deeply religious. Anything unexplained was blamed on divine wrath, demons, curses.
Right, so who is the unlucky saint this time?
Saint Vitus.
Saint Vitus, isn't he like the patron saint of dancers? Seems ironic.
Well, he was also associated with epilepsy and other conditions that cause tremors. People believe that if you offended him, he'd hit you with a dancing mania.
So they thought it was a divine punishment. Did anyone try to, apologize to Saint Vitus?
Oh, absolutely. People were making pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to him, hoping for a cure. Prayer, sacrifices, the whole deal.
Wow, so we've got mass hysteria, maybe triggered by anxieties, bad bread, and a saint's curse. That's a lot to unpack.
Right. It's amazing how all these factors come together in this historical puzzle.
Yeah.
And we're just getting started.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. Stick with us, folks. We'll be back with part 2 to dig even deeper into this bizarre historical enigma.
The more we look into this, the more it seems like the dancing plague wasn't just a one-time thing.
Really? So there were other dancing plagues?
Well, not exactly plagues, but throughout the Middle Ages, there were similar outbreaks of what they called dancing manias all over Europe.
Dancing manias.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of creepy.
Yeah, a bit. One famous example happened in 11th century Germany in a town called Kolbeck. Just like in Strasbourg, you had these huge groups of people suddenly dancing uncontrollably.
And they blamed it on God, too.
You bet. Divine judgment was the go-to explanation back then.
Wow, so this dancing thing was like a recurring nightmare for medieval Europe.
Kind of makes you wonder if something else was going on, right? Like maybe there were some deeper social or psychological factors that made people susceptible to these outbreaks.
That's a pretty unsettling thought. Were there any other weird outbreaks like this closer to Strasbourg, maybe?
There's this fascinating case from 15th century Italy. It's not exactly a dancing plague, but it shows how cultural beliefs and strange behaviors can get all tangled up.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So imagine a woman in the region of Apulia. She gets bitten by a tarantula.
A tarantula, like a big hairy spider.
Yep. And suddenly she starts dancing wildly.
Wait, so she dances because of a spider bite? That doesn't make sense.
Well, that's what they believed back then. The cure was even more dancing, but to specific music.
They thought dancing to the right song could cure a spider bite.
It sounds crazy to us, right? But this was a real phenomenon known as tarantism.
Tarantism.
Yeah, even scholars at the time thought that music had the power to counteract the tarantula's venom.
Of course, nowadays we know that tarantula bites aren't usually deadly.
Exactly. It seems like the dancing was more of a cultural reaction to fear and anxiety.
So even though tarantism is different from the dancing plague, they have some things in common.
Definitely. They both involve strange, involuntary behavior. And the solutions people came up with were shaped by their beliefs at the time.
It's like those beliefs filled in the gaps in their understanding. Instead of science, they had folklore and superstition.
And that really highlights how culture shapes the way we understand and react to illness. Even today, our ideas about health and sickness are influenced by our culture.
Okay, back to Strasbourg. There's one big question that keeps coming up for me. Did people actually dance themselves to death during the plague?
That's a tough one. And honestly, it's still debated among historians. Some accounts, written years after the event, claim people were dying left and right, like 15 deaths per day at the peak.
15 deaths a day, that's awful.
It would be devastating. But here's the thing. These accounts were written much later, so we have to wonder how accurate they really are.
So are there any records from the time of the plague itself that mention all these deaths?
This is where it gets even more confusing. Contemporary sources from Strasbourg, things like official records, don't mention deaths at all.
Wait, so the sources closest to the event don't say anything about people dying?
It's a real head-scratcher. You've got these dramatic claims of mass casualties, but the primary sources are silent on the matter.
So which sources are we supposed to believe? How do historians even begin to figure this out?
It takes a lot of careful analysis, that's for sure. One historian, John Waller, has spent a lot of time researching the dancing plague. He thinks the real death toll might be unknown, but potentially significant.
So he's not ruling out the possibility that people did die.
Not necessarily. He acknowledges that there's just not enough solid evidence from the time to say for sure.
So basically, it's a mystery wrapped in an enigma.
Pretty much. It goes to show how tricky history can be. We're often working with incomplete information, and there's always the chance that biases can creep into the way events are recorded and interpreted.
So we might never know the real death toll from the dancing plague.
It's possible. But even without all the answers, it's an event that keeps fascinating and challenging us, don't you think?
Absolutely. It makes you think about the power of belief, the fragility of social order.
Exactly. It really highlights how complex human behavior can be and how much we still don't understand about ourselves and the world around us.
Okay, so we've gone through some pretty wild theories about the dancing plague, but let's go back to that idea of mass hysteria for a second. Remember, Strasbourg was a city under a lot of pressure back then. Famine, disease, political instability, the whole nine yards.
Yeah, it was a tough time to be alive. You could say it was like a tinderbox, just waiting for a spark.
And then Frau Treffet comes along, dancing like a woman possessed. That must have been quite the spark.
Exactly. Imagine you're there, already on edge from all the stress and uncertainty. Then you see this. It's unsettling. It's contagious.
So people were literally dancing out of stress, like their anxieties were turning into this physical thing.
That's the idea behind psychogenic illness. Yeah. Psychological distress, like stress or anxiety, can actually cause real physical symptoms.
Okay, but how does stress turn into uncontrollable dancing? I mean, I get stressed, but I don't just bust a move.
Well, think about it. Our minds and bodies are connected, right? Stress can cause headaches, muscle tension, even heart problems. So in this case, maybe the extreme stress was triggering this physical response, this urge to move.
Right, but why dancing? Why not something else?
That's the million-dollar question. We can only speculate. Maybe it had something to do with the cultural context, the way people expressed themselves back then. Or maybe there was some underlying neurological thing that we just don't understand yet.
Fair enough. But how do we explain the fact that hundreds of people were doing this? It wasn't just one or two people. It was like a citywide dance party gone wrong.
That's where social contagion comes in. You see your neighbor dancing, you hear rumors of a plague, fear starts to spread,
Mhm.
and when people are already stressed and scared, they become more susceptible to this kind of thing.
It's like a collective freak out, but instead of screaming, they're dancing.
In a way, yeah. It shows how powerful social dynamics can be, how our emotions and behaviors can spread through a group, especially when there's a sense of fear or danger.
So it's not so different from what we see today, right? I mean, think about viral trends, how quickly they spread. People see others doing something and they feel compelled to join in.
Exactly. Or think about those cases of mass psychogenic illness, like the laughing epidemic in Tanzania. A group of schoolgirls started laughing uncontrollably, and it spread to others, leading to school closures and a ton of anxiety.
So the dancing plague might seem like this bizarre thing from the past, but it's actually relevant to us today. We might not be dancing in the streets, but we face our own stressors, right? Work, social media, the economy, it's a lot.
And those modern stressors can affect our mental and physical health, just like they did back in 1518. So it's important to learn how to manage stress, to build resilience, and to be aware of how our social environment can impact us.
That's such a great point. We're not just individuals, we're part of a larger social fabric. And that fabric can influence us in ways we might not even realize.
It's definitely something to keep in mind.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From bad bread to St. Vitus's curse to the power of the mind. It's been quite the deep dive.
It really has. And I think it's a good reminder that even though we live in a modern world with all this scientific knowledge, there are still mysteries out there, things we might never fully understand.
Absolutely, but that's part of what makes history so fascinating, right? It's like a giant puzzle, and we're constantly searching for new pieces to help us make sense of it all.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the dancing plague of 1518.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.